it's not enough. The Muslims are still, many are still afraid to speak. But I think the very left and the audacity that they would speak in, and the right and the audacity that fueled, let me say it that way. So you've got two sides. The right is speaking in a full power against the left, and the left are speaking in full power against the right, is I would say giving us the sentiments and the inspiration. Don't be afraid. I think this is what's happening. The right is giving us the power, I would say, the inspiration. Don't be afraid to speak against the left. And the left is giving us, don't be afraid to speak against the right. And here we are, we're actually right now getting that inspiration to speak against the left and speak against the right. To speak against the left and speak against the right. And I think I'm optimistic that it's going to be bringing in somewhat of later a Muslim stance, but I still think, to be honest, looking at the newer generation and the MSAs, I think I was more optimistic before than now, to be honest. Yeah. The generation that is right now very vocal, and we're looking at a generation, the mid 30s, 40s, I think they're doing an outstanding job in being very vocal. I was really surprised to hear, what was his name? Hosam Zulot or something like that, did an outstanding job on CNN, on BBC, outstanding job, and very outspoken to actually speak in such language. But when I look at the younger generation, here's one thing. I think sometimes to use this type of political correctness often, I think we have a lot of activists that have been using this type of political correctness rhetoric, that at many times it gets the younger generation confused. And they don't know where that fine line is, and where, you see, political correctness carries within it a lot of hypocrisy, that diplomacy, and not knowing how to speak to the Muslim audiences versus how to speak to the politicians. The politicians, you talk to them in a different language because they're con artists and actually speaking in hypocrisy. Con artists and speaking in hypocrisy. And the truth of the matter is that you don't have the power to speak in your full ideas. You recognize that you don't necessarily have the full freedom to speak your mind, because there's a certain power, there's a certain authority, and where it will lay out certain paradigms on who agrees with what and who disagrees with what, and you're put within that paradigm, regardless of what you think is right and what the reality and the truth is. And you basically are subject to somehow being included within a certain paradigm, and then you end up putting your life, your freedom, your children, your family at risk, and all of that, and you end up really, sometimes needing to use this political correctness when you're talking to politicians, when you're talking to the media, etc. That's a different way. But when we're seeing this type of political correctness is really the method that we're even teaching the students and even the Muslim community, I think we've got a problem. Because if the Yahud are speaking in their full voices, the loudest voices, this is a Jewish land, the God promised land, and we're afraid to say Surah Al Isra, we're afraid to speak about our own faith, we're afraid to speak about Sharia and defend the deen, the nafs, the aql, the ird, the mal, the legal maxims in Islam, we're afraid to use that and we're afraid to speak our minds, then we're really in problem. You're in a big problem right here. When we couldn't even identify, and we think that Palestine is a social justice issue. There's no doubt that there's a lot of social injustice that's happening. There's no doubt about that. But if we're still just talking and reducing Palestine as a social injustice issue, then we've got a problem. Because it's not just a social injustice issue, it's a aqeedah issue. If you don't actually talk about it as a aqeedah issue, yet they have all the audacity to actually speak about the 70 million in America, the Republicans, we're actually in support of Israel because they're basically the children of Israel, blah, blah, blah. And Israel is basically, well, this is a Jewish state, and the Knesset, this is a Jewish state, and etc. And that they would yell at Ahmad al-Tibi for speaking in Arabic at the Knesset, even though he's actually part of the Knesset, because they regarded that, no, this is supposed to be, the Hebrew language is supposed to be the official language of the Israeli Jewish state. But then we're afraid to actually stand up for Islam, afraid to be somehow regarded as somehow theocratic or regarded as backwards, that we're actually calling for some kind of a Muslim, an Islamic theocratic, Muslim perspective on Palestine. We've got a problem. Got all the audacity to speak about a Jewish state. They've got all the audacity. Why are we afraid? No, seriously, why are we afraid? So it's I don't know, why did we get here? I have no idea. All right, how did we get there? I guess when, Palestine every single once in a while just rises again and again, and we just cannot whatsoever just dismiss it. And I think it's really important to remember when we speak about Palestine, it's really important to remember that the Prophet ﷺ, when he did Isra wal Mi'raj, it's always connecting the different areas of Tawheed, whether we're talking about Prophet Ibrahim, whether we're talking about even connecting, and even the Prophet ﷺ, while he was on his deathbed, ordering Usama ibn Zayd, you have to continue your path to Palestine. You need to continue Mu'tah. You have to continue that. You need to continue with the Sariyat Usama. It has to continue. All of that in Isra wal Mi'raj, the day, Subhana alladhi asra bi'abdihi laylan min al-masjid al-haram. But unfortunately, many are using this, this type of reduction where they are picturing like it's just a humanitarian issue, like it's just a social injustice issue. I think that's reducing it in that way and just focusing on that area is confusing many, is really confusing many. Because when even you go to Palestine, okay, the social injustice that's actually happening in Gaza, there's no question about that. The social injustices that are happening on the other side, there's no question about that. But to be honest, the social injustice that is happening in Al-Quds, in the West Bank, and in the 1948 areas is not comparable to the social injustice that is happening in all the Arabic countries in the Middle East, period. I know many are not going to like what I say. You want to talk about the prisoners, the 60,000 prisoners under Sisi are going through a lot worse conditions than the 11,000 under Israeli occupation. Those that were imprisoned by MBS, they're suffering a lot more than those that are actually in the Israeli prisons. So if you want to talk about social injustice issue, well, let's put some things in perspective, to be honest. Let's just put some things in perspective. This is not whatsoever in defense of Israel. Absolutely not. This is not in defense of Israel. Absolutely not. Injustice is an injustice, but Palestine is not a social justice issue. It's, yes, part of it is a social justice issue, but to reduce it to that angle is really letting our vision as Muslims, when we're talking about Muslims, we're then confusing our visions. Why Palestine? If you want to talk about social injustice, well, then you shouldn't be just talking about Palestine. You should be talking about the Muslims in Myanmar, in China, in India, in Syria. If you want to talk about social justice, then you should actually talk about those because they're suffering even more. But the connection with Palestine is not a social injustice issue. It's not a social injustice issue. It's actually Aqidah. That's what Palestine is all about. It's an Aqidah issue and not a social injustice issue. Because if you want to make it a social injustice issue, then you got to talk about the other countries first. Then you got to talk about social injustice. You got to talk about Syria. You got to talk about the social injustices that are happening in so many different countries, India, Muslim countries under Muslims, etc. You want to talk about social injustice, then it's not just Israel. But if you want to look at Palestine, no, Palestine is an issue of Aqidah. That's why when we talk about Palestine, it becomes more than a Palestinian issue. It's not a nationalist issue. It's an Aqidah issue. It's an issue to curtail the ummah. It's an issue to be a dagger in the heart of the ummah, to weaken the ummah, unless we put our perspectives in place, then we're not solving our matters right. If you're not seeing the picture from the right angle and you take away the blurry image, if you're not taking away the blurry image, then you're confused on how you want to present the issue of Palestine. The issue of Palestine, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put it right at the heart of the Quran. Why? Because it is an issue where even the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تقوم الساعة حتى يقاتل المسلمون اليهود أنتم على شرقية وهم على غربية. Straight, clear. إلا شجرة الغرقد, specific kind of tree. فإنها من شجر اليهود. Too clear. Why was the Prophet ﷺ bringing this up? Because he wanted to remind us that it's an Aqidah issue. It's not some kind of a nationalist issue. And it's really sad that we're seeing a lot of Palestinians, when they want to celebrate or bring about that revival of al-Qadiyya al-Palestiniya and all of that, what are they doing? They're basically putting these guys and girls do the debka and wear their Palestinian thawban, etc. And all this kind of rhetoric. If you're reviving more of that nationalism, the Jahiliyyah. Are you serious? Palestine is not a Jahiliyyah issue. It's a Aqidah issue. It's a Deen issue. It's a Surah Al-Isra issue. It's a Surah Al-Hashr issue. It's an issue of Surah Al-Baqarah. It's an issue of La ilaha illallah from the very base of it. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us about Prophet Yaqub, about Prophet Musa alayhi salam, udkhulul ard. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell us that? Because he's telling us, well, you see that Palestine issue. You see, when we told Bani Israel to go to Palestine, that was because they were supposed to take the mission. They were supposed to carry the mission of La ilaha illallah, but then they failed it. Now you've got a mission to continue that mission of Prophet Musa. Continue the mission of Prophet Ibrahim. Continue the mission of Prophet Ismail and Ishaq and Yaqub. Why? كنتم شهداء إذ حضر يعقوب الموت. ما تعبدون من بعدي قالوا نعبد إلهك وإله آبائك إبراهيم وإسماعيل وإسحاق إله واحدة ونحن له مسلمون. That's the whole idea. That's the whole idea. But if the Yahud have the audacity to actually connect themselves to the land and say, well, this is the land of Isaac, this is the land of our prophets, this is the land of Solomon, King Solomon, or Shiloh, or whatever it is, and the king of David, and etc. They've got all of it. What is the name Israel coming from? Well, it's basically Yaqub. They're connecting themselves with the prophets. They're claiming to be connected to Israel, Yaqub, claiming to be connected with the Torah, claiming to be connected with Prophet Musa, Yusuf, Sulaiman, Dawood, and we're afraid to say that. We're afraid to actually say, no, نحن أولى بهم. أولى بهؤلاء. We are supposed to be the ones that are connecting to the prophets, Musa and Ismail and Ishaq and Ibrahim. We're أولى. They recognized that the whole issue, and they were willing to say that we're connecting ourselves with Allah, with the Torah, with Musa, with Sulaiman, with Dawood, and we're like, no, we're not connected. And we don't want to connect with Dawood. We don't want to connect with Musa. We don't want to connect with Ismail or with Ishaq. We don't want to connect with that. It's a social injustice issue. So they're willing to connect to the prophets, but we're shy to say that. We're shy to say we're connecting ourselves with the prophets. We've got a problem. We've got a problem, and we're still just emphasizing that Palestine is a social injustice issue. The Yahudi is claiming to be basically there for Palestine, for Ishaq, sorry, I keep saying Ismail, for Ishaq and Ibrahim and all those prophets. And we're still insisting to disassociate ourselves with al-Anbiya. Not until we associate ourselves with the reason why we're connecting to Palestine is that it is because the land of al-Anbiya, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us victory. Because man ista'azza bi ghayri Allah adallahu Allah. You seek izzah, you seek honor through other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you dhillah. Not until you connect yourself. That the reason why we're connected to Palestine is because we're connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we're connected to the Quran, because we're connected to the books of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we're connected to the Anbiya, because we're connected to Ismail, because we're connected, with Ishaq, with Ibrahim, with Sulaiman, with Dawood, with Yaqub. But if al-Yahudi is saying, I go back to the prophets, and we are insisting that we have nothing to do with this, nothing to do with the Anbiya, because we keep on continuing to say Palestine is Ard Canaan. We keep on insisting that, the reason why we're here is because we belong to the Canaanites. So you connect yourself with the pagans, but they're connecting themselves with the prophets. You want to connect yourself with the pagans, and they're connecting themselves with the prophets. We are awla. Prophet ﷺ said, نحن أولى بموسى منهم. Not until we correct our vision and we recognize that the issue is we're connecting Palestine. Palestine is not a national issue. It's an issue of al-Anbiya. It's an issue of a mission. It's an issue of connecting it with La ilaha illallah, with what the Prophet ﷺ was telling us to do. Not an issue of social injustice. Social injustice is one piece of it. One piece of it. But did you expect a kafir to treat you like their own people? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, wait a minute. You need to figure things out. We need to figure things out. That's why, what's one of the reasons why we're actually failing when it comes to educating the youth, especially the Muslims on Palestine, because we're so focused on talking about the casualties and the injustices, etc. And we didn't actually get their aqidah in place. We're just so focused on talking about the casualties like it's a social injustice issue. Guess what happens? They go to Palestine. This is real. They go to Palestine. They do tours there. And they discover that a lot of the Palestinians, whether we're talking about Al-Quds or whether we're talking about 1948 or whether we're talking about the West Bank, that they're actually living in a better lifestyle than those Muslims that are living in the UK, living in South Africa, or living in America. So they start getting confused. It's like, wait a minute. They're actually living in a better place than what I'm living in. They start getting confused. I thought I was fighting for a social injustice issue. Look at them. They're actually living in a better place than me. Their income is actually better than mine. So that they come back, leaving the Palestinian cause, or at least the situation, and thinking I was manipulated. No, because all along you went there with the vision that this was a social injustice issue. And you didn't recognize that the cause was not a social injustice issue. The issue is bigger than that. It's a dagger in the heart of the ummah. Even when you look at history in 1917 and when they actually did the Sykes-Picot Agreement and all of that, and when you look at the times when it was in 1924, when it was the end of the Uthmani Khilafah, it was really all in order to dismantle the ummah. To dismantle the ummah. It wasn't an issue of just making a social injustice. It was to dismantle the ummah. What got the ummah into that? It was also the ummah itself, plotted against itself. With the Sharif Hussein and all, it went against the Uthmani Khilafah because they were manipulated to believe that the Ottoman Khilafah, that it was really just nothing but a discriminated Khilafah, and that the Arab were a minority, so fight against them. And then we fought against our own selves in support of who? In support of UK and support of France. And we were promised that somehow we're going to get our independence, and we believed it. We fought against who? We fought against the Muslim. And we believed who? We believed UK and we believed France. We're doing it again. We're again seeking support from who? We're wanting the United Nations to give us support. Well, they're the ones that actually said in 1967 that they actually had the right to create their state. You're doing it again. You're still looking for United Nations to actually give you the approval. You're still wanting France to give you somehow the support. How on earth did you think that France was going to give you the support when they couldn't even approve, couldn't even accept a girl to cover her body, couldn't even accept a hijab to be over her head? They're going to accept to give you any type of a recognition for your faith? Our problem is when we're not recognizing our Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling you, don't wait for a kafir to give you izzah. Don't wait for a kafir to give you izzah. Don't wait. You recognize your deen. You recognize where those lines are in order to recognize what union you're really seeking. The Ummah's union can be only with La ilaha illallah. Got a problem. Go ahead, my dear.
I think you just answered my question. Like the layman, whoever is in the West, they're like, what can we do about like the issue of Palestine or like the injustices going on against them?
So,
I think you just answered that.
Let me tell you one thing. Definitely, even social injustice, we definitely have to work towards uplifting any social injustice, whether that was against a Muslim or a non-Muslim. So when I work and say what I said, that does not whatsoever mean that we shouldn't be doing the other parts, whether we're talking to the Congress people or whether we're sending out letters or whether we're, speaking about the social injustices that are happening. All right. That doesn't mean that we don't amplify and scrutinize those social injustices. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be working on that. But there's a huge difference between just making it a social injustice issue and between understanding the foundation in Aqidah and how you implement that and transfer it from Aqidah to an action. So what does that mean? As a Muslim, I understand the Aqidah part of it. The connection with Palestine is an issue of Aqidah. Now, on ground, when I want to talk about it, it depends. If I'm talking to politicians, I'm going to amplify the part about social injustices, how they're against international law, and all of that talk. All right? Because I'm supposed to use the norms and the means that are right now common today in order to channel towards bringing in justice. Okay? Whether it's using international law or whether it's using the media or whether it's creating groups of MSAs or whatever it is in order to bring about that awareness, because that's channeling at least towards bringing in social justice. But we should not speak in a reductionist language and make it seem like it's just a social injustice issue. That's what I'm against. That's what I'm against. Should we not use the other channels? Of course you should. But it's really important to also explain that when we speak about the social injustices that are happening in Palestine, we should not make it that it's just against Palestine. Because the social injustice that's happening, whether in Syria, in Egypt, in India, wherever it may be, that should also be a Muslim cause, because the death of one innocent Muslim, or the death of one person, is actually more dangerous, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considered it as even severer than demolishing the whole Kaaba. Stone after stone. That the life of one Muslim innocent person is more sacred than all of the Kaaba. The Kaaba itself, with all the sanctity that it carries. So whether that person is in India, or whether that person is in China, or whether that person is in Africa, or whether that person is in Palestine, their life is sacred. If you're going to talk about social injustice, their life is sacred. But when we talk about Palestine, to reduce it like it's a nationalist issue, like it's a Palestinian issue, has unfortunately gotten a lot of Palestinians perverted, and I would say perverted, because they had thought that by having girls and guys sit together and mix and dance in a debka, that was somehow going to be reviving the cause of Palestine. That's Jahiliyyah. That won't revive the cause of Palestine. That's Jahiliyyah. The cause of Palestine is not going to be revived by a debka with girls and guys dancing together and the girl wearing thawb somehow thinking that, yeah, here we're reviving the cause of Palestine. If the cause of Palestine was going to be revived by girls and guys dancing together, I'm sorry, I'd rather have Israel. At least I'll get some, to be honest, I'd rather have Israel than actually have the Palestinian Authority. If it's a secular issue, I'd rather have Israel. But I'm not looking for a secular Jewish state. I'm looking for Islam.
الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
So someone commented that a good relief and no worries about the siege. No, we should worry, because at the end of the day is that injustices are supposed to be things that we should campaign against. All right. So whether we're talking about stopping the water, whether we're talking about curfews, demolishing homes, the killing of people, imprisonment of people, raping, etc., that should be something that we should be campaigning and definitely resisting using the different means. If you're in America, calling your senator, calling your Congress, whatever it is, talking about it in schools, talking about it at universities, talking about it everywhere, on the streets, whatever it is, bring in the education, etc. This is one means of actually stopping the injustice. So this is part of what you should be working towards, or whether it's calling your representatives, etc. So whatever means that are legal out there, you want to make sure that you want to be protected and safe, all right? But at the same time, use the channels that are out there in order to help you uplift the injustice. So yes, you are then transferring, you recognize the Aqidah piece of it, but then let's put some of it into, then we're talking about the injustices, the social injustices, etc. Now that's one side of it, not all the side. Are you guys with me? Okay. We were supposed to make it into a tafsir class, but we couldn't not talk about Palestine, right? We just couldn't. All right. للرجال نصيب مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون وللنساء نصيب مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون مما قل منه أو كثر نصيبا مفروضا. So what happened here is, of course, you want to keep in mind that the ayat, they basically went into speaking about from, laying out the prelude right here and talking about خلقكم من نفس واحدة, were created from one soul, and then spoke about that division in terms of right there, اتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام. You have to have taqwa in the one that you will be asked about, and al-arham, the relatives. And then it went into another division, talked about the orphans, and then went to another division, talked about the vulnerable. So now we're talking about the vulnerable. The first vulnerable part were the orphans, how to deal with the orphans. Then we talked about the other vulnerable, which basically are the women. And then we talked about the ayah went into speaking about understanding and laying out, when speaking about vulnerable people, then you're going to talk about social justice, right? The social justice piece of it. And the most important piece is really the part about money, right? So then it laid out how to deal with, in regards to money, the orphans' rights over certain wealth, and how, whether we're talking about the wali, or whether we're talking about the wasi, or whether we're talking about the different guardians taking care of the orphans, how they treat and how they deal with the money, in whether we're talking about distribution or whether we're talking about care, how that is to be considered for the orphans. So when we speak about is-sufaha, this basically is a totally different conversation. When we talked about as-sufaha, was it referring to women, was it referring to the orphans, or whether was it referring to the sufaha, those that don't know or don't have the capacity to use the money in the fair, or at least the way that fair distribution would be in using the money. And we talked about in detail in regards to that. And of course, when we're speaking about money, that basically acts as, whether we're talking about the actual cash or whether we're talking about property, at the end of the day, it's basically the money that usually is the center for social justice and social injustice, right? So even when we're talking about Israel, for example, it's really an issue of the West needing Israel to be there in order to be a key area to control the Muslim countries because of the resources that Muslim countries have. The Muslim countries have these resources. Israel basically, or Palestine, of course, and Israel is sitting in a strategic area to control the Muslim world. It has nothing to do at all with Israel believing, or even Jews believing, that it was God's promised land. In fact, most Jews are actually not adhering to the Torah. Most Jews don't actually believe that the Torah is the word of God. Most Jews consider that Judaism is really a nationality. In other words, it's an issue of a nationalism and not necessarily a religion. So it's their culture, etc. In other words, it's a cultural thing. And a lot of Jews are actually secular. In fact, those that are defending those are in the so-called IDF, Israeli Defense Force, or Israeli Occupation Force, most of them are actually, in fact, all of them are secular and not religious. The 67% of the, well, whether we're talking about the Hashmonaim or we're talking about the Orthodox Jews, the far right, they don't actually participate in the Israeli Defense Force, or so-called. They don't even participate in the war. You know what that means? That actually means that Israel is a secular state. It's a secular state. It's not a religious state. You know what that explains? It explains that Israel is not an issue of religion, even though it was a religious rhetoric that combined the Jews in Palestine, but they don't necessarily, I would say it's the rhetoric that they managed during 1897 through the Basel Convention with Theodor Herzl, in order to combine the Jews in a state. And it wasn't necessarily Palestine. There were a number of different options. It was to create a new ghetto. All right. Ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. We'll continue after class, inshallah.
الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. إذا جاءك المنافقون قالوا نشهد إنك لرسول الله
والله يعلم إنك لرسوله والله يشهد إن المنافقين لكاذبون اتخذوا أيمانهم جنة فصدوا عن سبيل الله إنهم ساء ما كانوا يعملون ذلك بأنهم آمنوا ثم كفروا فطبع على قلوبهم فهم لا يفقهون وإذا رأيتهم تعجبك أجسامهم وإن يقولوا تسمع لقولهم كأنهم خشب مسندة يحسبون كل صيحة عليهم هم العدو فاحذرهم قاتلهم الله أنى يؤفكون وإذا قيل لهم تعالوا يستغفر لكم رسول الله لووا رؤوسهم وإذا رأيتهم لووا رؤوسهم ورأيتهم يصدون وهم مستكبرون وإذا قيل لهم تعالوا يستغفر لكم رسول الله لووا رؤوسهم ورأيتهم يصدون وهم مستكبرون سواء عليهم أستغفرت لهم أم لم تستغفر لهم لن يغفر الله لهم إن الله لا يهدي القوم الفاسقين هم الذين يقولون لا تنفقوا على من عند رسول الله حتى ينفضوا ولله خزائن السماوات والأرض ولكن المنافقين لا يفقهون يقولون لئن رجعنا إلى المدينة ليخرجن الأعز منها الأذل ولله العزة ولرسوله وللمؤمنين ولله العزة ولرسوله وللمؤمنين ولكن المنافقين لا يعلمون الله أكبر يا الله حمدا الله الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تلهكم أموالكم ولا أولادكم عن ذكر الله ومن يفعل ذلك فأولئك هم الخاسرون وأنفقوا مما رزقناكم من قبل أن يأتي أحدكم الموت فيقول رب لولا أخرتني إلى أجل قريب إلى أجل قريب فأصدق وأكن من الصالحين ولن يؤخر الله نفسا إذا جاء أجلها ولن يؤخر الله نفسا إذا جاء أجلها والله خبير بما تعملون الله أكبر الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله
You guys don't want to pray sunnah? Okay. Let's do it. Let's continue. All right. So when it was talking about the different types of vulnerable groups, whether we're talking about women, whether we're talking about the orphans, and of course, then went in details to bring about the justice in terms of wealth distribution. That's why it went on to recognize. I want you guys to look at this one. You know, this one's really interesting right there, and where when we talk about, okay, well, how can I do this? Let's put got it. When he talks about the reason for money, we want to look at this one. وَلَا تُؤْتُوا السُّفَهَاءَ أَمْوَالَكُمُ الَّتِي جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ قِيَامًا وَارْزُقُوهُمْ فِيهَا. So when you're talking about money, we mentioned this last time, that the main reason for money is really in order to do al-qiyam. What is al-qiyam? And we talked about al-qiyam, whether it is al-qiyam bi-amr ad-din. In other words, what is money there for? What do we do and use money for? Whether we're speaking about money or whether we're talking about efforts or whether we're talking about time. If the person is not putting them in the place that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had wanted that money or effort or time be put in, then that would be considered as wasted energy, or wasted energy, whether that energy meant money or energy meant bodily effort or any type of effort, or whether that energy was speaking about time. So all of that is considered as it must be distributed in where it's put in for the cause of the deen, the cause of person's health, whether we're talking about the individual, or whether we're talking about the society, or whether we're talking about mental health, or whether we're talking about family and chastity, or whether we're talking about the fair distribution of wealth and property in the society. Now, these are important to keep in mind because in Islam, for example, can somebody say that their job is to probably open up a gaming store, or just by gaming, they're getting money just by participating in games? Is that halal? No. Why not? The person is just doing gaming. He's not harming anybody with it. So in Islam, it is not, the line is not whether you're harming anybody with it directly, even if that energy is not bringing in something that brings in, one, the support in the deen, the principle within the ummah, two, or the support for the security and the life of the masses or the individual, three, or whether we're talking about the mental health for the individual or the masses, or we're talking about chastity, or we're talking about bringing in money and income for the society, where it's bringing in a good prosperity for the society, then in that situation, that would be considered as haram money. So whether we're talking about probably, oh yeah, I'm going to play a game, it's not enough to just speak about money, for example, that it would be haram only in riba. But no, even if we're talking about money coming in just for entertainment, but it's not bringing in prosperity to the society, that would be considered haram income. Be considered as haram income. So a person saying, well, my job is to make games or gaming or whatever, that's actually considered haram income. Got it? Haram income. So that's why when we look at التي جعل الله لكم قياما, it's in order to put the perspective of how we understand what it is to be not a safih. What's the opposite of a safih? A rashid. The opposite of a safih is a rashid. What's the evidence? Right here. وابتلوا اليتامى حتى إذا بلغوا النكاح فإن آنستم منهم رشدا. So what is rushda? Yes, rushd is to reach the age of maturity, but that's basically the age, the opposite of a safih. That's the opposite of a safih, because a safih is a person that doesn't recognize where to put their effort, their money, or their time in. Why? Because they don't have their perspective in place. What's the evidence? In Surah Al-Hujurat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to us about what it means to be الراشد. What was that? حبب إليكم الإيمان زينه في قلوبكم كره إليكم الكفر والفسوق والعصيان أولئك هم الراشدون. So what does it basically consider? That the center is when you have al-Iman in place. The person's definition of Iman is not in place, then what they're going to have is a total misunderstanding of what it means to do a fair distribution, what it means to do the right distribution of effort, money, and time. Got it? Now, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there emphasizes, Balaghun nikah, it's not enough that they reach the age of puberty, but it is necessary that they had reached a vision and a maturity level where they understand what it means to put the efforts in place. Effort of money, effort of physical effort, or whether we're talking about time. All right. So at the end of the day, putting all those areas in place is in order to help us understand that not because somebody is basically going to be leaving behind money, that doesn't necessarily mean that we just distribute it fairly. That's why in Islam, when we're speaking about fair distribution, in Islam, it's based on a number of different things. للرجال نصيب مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون وللنساء نصيب مما ترك الوالدان والأقربون. It's important to mention that in the early days of Islam, the ones to inherit from one another before Islam, let's start out with that. Before Islam, the ones to inherit were basically the men who were capable of fighting in the war. So they would consider it's really the more like a feudalist type of distribution for the wealth. So it's basically the men that were in the noble areas, the men that were considered the chieftains, the men that were the warriors, were the ones that were getting the inheritance. They were the ones to take all the money. Why? It was considered that was in order to keep the security for the rest of the community. So therefore, we have to subsidize these people. We have to subsidize these people. When Islam came in, here's what happened. There is a Sahabiya, her name was Kujja. It's a very funny name, very different name, okay? What happened was that when she had two daughters, when her husband died, her brother-in-law, which is the paternal aunt for the girls, he took all the money. And he said, well, we're the ones that are fighting to protect the girls. In other words, we should be taking that money in order to maintain their security. That's when this ayah was revealed, that the men nasib, they would have a portion of the inheritance. The Prophet ﷺ said the daughters bring back the money, the daughters would get 2/3, the mother would get 1/8 of that inheritance, and you would get the rest. That is Mr. Uncle. لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ الْوَالِدَانِ. For the men, they would have a portion of what the parents had left behind, or even the relatives. وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ. And even the women, despite the fact that before before Islam, the women did not inherit anything because they were considered as not whatsoever a means of war, or at least they were not going to be any way bringing in any support within the war. So they were considered as, well, they didn't need the money. We do all the security. We take care of their defense. Therefore, we should be the ones to take the money, not them. So Islam basically came in and regarded that no, there are three main reasons to why inheritance happens. One, yes, the person is deceased, but you're looking at the relative, the person is Muslim. Two, the person is a relative, a close relative. The closer the person is to the deceased, the expected higher amount to be. Number three is looking at whether the person is a mawla, so al-itq, whether the person was an ex-slave or not. Now, one thing is that the distribution of wealth in Islam in inheritance is called al-fara'id, ilmul fara'id. And the reason why it's called fara'id is because of this word right here, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, nasiban mafruda. What is nasiba? In nasib means a portion. Il-mafrud actually means what is obligatory. That's why we say fard al-salah, right? We say fard al-salah. This is fard. So mafrud to mean that it was a distribution in where it is a systemic, it's put into a system, a certain system of wealth distribution in the laws of inheritance in where it is obligatory. That's why it's called fara'id, in where it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that assigned how the distribution takes place. And of course, وَمِمَّا قَلَّ مِنْهُ أَوْ كَثُرَ, whether the amount to be distributed, whether it's a small portion or whether it's a large portion. A number of different things to say before we even talk about inheritance and ilm al-fara'id. Before speaking about distributing the wealth, before even starting to distribute the wealth, we first have to do three things. Number one is use that money that was left behind in order to cover all the funeral costs for the deceased. That's the first thing. We're going to need to cover the funeral cost, whether we're looking at the burial. Here in Minnesota, it costs almost $6,000, almost $7,000 to bury a person. That would include the burial, the shrouding, and the washing. That's actually a lot of money for a lot of people. Okay, $6,000, and in fact, it's almost 7,000 to be exact. Number two is that we're going to pay off the debt from that deceased's money before we even distribute any wealth. We're going to see, in order to see whether the person has any debt, we definitely need to have witnesses. We need to see, do you have any evidence to prove that this person owed you any money? Or at least this person owes you any money? Or you owe him money? We're going to see, you need evidence, whether we need written documents or whether we need witnesses or we need different types of evidence to prove that there was a debt that you have the right to get it and to be deducted from the money that they had left behind. Number three is the will. That is before even distributing the inheritance. For the will can be no more than 1/3 of the wealth that is left behind. No more than 1/3. So if the person left behind a will and that will was going to take more than 1/3, we're going to deduct only 1/3 and no more. We don't cancel out the will, but we would give them to no more than 1/3 of the will. Number two, the will cannot be for someone that inherits. So you cannot get an inheritance and a will at the same time. So let's say your father made a will for you to get $5,000. Let's just assume that that was within within the portion of 1/3. Let's just assume, well, you cannot actually get a will. Now, that doesn't mean that you cannot get, or you would get to choose the will or the inheritance. It doesn't mean that you get to choose. By default, if you are one of the inheritors, you do not get a will. By default, if you're one of the inheritors, you do not get a will. It's not that, okay, let me see which one I should choose. Is it the will or the inheritance? You would only get the inheritors if you're part of those that inherit, but not a will and inheritance. Go ahead, my dear.
Are they both obligatory? Which one is obligatory? I mean, between the will and the inheritance.
It's actually both. So even the will, if there is a will, the ayah was really clear. من بعد وصية يوصي بها أو دين. So when we do the distribution, we cannot do the distribution before وصية يوصى بها أو دين, before distributing first the will. Before distributing the wealth, we have to first look at the wasiyah and also look at the debt. من بعد وصية يوصى بها أو دين. All right, so we don't distribute anything until we actually get that. Here we go. من بعد وصية يوصي بها أو دين. You're going to go and look at all of that. You would not distribute anything until you look at the wasiyah that he did, that he wassa biha. Any wasiyah wassa biha or adain, we would say, well, the ayah is clear. من بعد وصية يوصي بها أو دين. Therefore, we're going to distribute not until after we make sure that we don't have a wasiyah and we don't have a debt. If there is a debt, there is a wasiyah, we're going to deduct that from the money that the person had left behind. Got it? All right. So what if there's something called a shuf'a, or if when we're talking about a shuf'a, what if we would have shared property? There would be something called the shuf'a. In property in where it's clear that here's one house, there's one house, and we would bring about an estimation to the value of that house and an estimation to the value of that house, and then we would look at the shares and we would give each and every single one their share. But what if it was one house? We're not going to give you the bathroom and the kitchen and then say, well, you take 2 rooms and I'll take 1 room, and etc. It's going to be something called a shuf'a. What is a shuf'a? A shuf'a is when you would have a shared property that is owned by more than one shareholder. In that situation, the person cannot sell their share until they also take at least the other person's shareholder. They would offer them, they have the priority of buying the other person's share with an equivalent price. So what does that mean? Let's just assume we have a $200,000 home. 2 sisters, Sister A and B. Sister B is living in Tennessee. Sister B decided, well, I'm living in Tennessee. My mother left a home for us. Here it is. But Sister A is living in Minnesota. Sister A wanted to abuse the fact that Sister B is living in Tennessee. So she decided, well, I'll just tell her. Sister B wanted to abuse that and say, well, if you want to buy my share, I'm selling it for $300,000. But the truth of the matter, well, it's actually only worth $1,000 because the whole home is worth $2,000. So So what does she do? She basically wants to somehow abuse her sister's need and say, well, I'm selling it for $300,000 because she recognizes, sister B recognizes that for her sister, she really needs that home and she wouldn't be able to afford another home. So she would basically abuse her need. That is basically haram. So what would be fair? We would basically get a person that is specialized in making an evaluation to the home and say, well, if you, sister A, you would like to buy your sister's share, this is how much this is worth, and that we would divide it in two in that situation and say, well, this is how much that share would worth to make it fair. Not abuse that you recognize that your sister needs the home and that you live in Tennessee, so you basically want to sell your share and then abuse her her need. All right. وَإِذَا حَضَرَ الْقِسْمَةَ أُولُو الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينَ فَارْزُقُوهُم مِّنْهُ وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Now, this ayah, there was a debate between scholars whether this ayah is mansukha or not. What is al-mansukh? Al-mansukh, in English, they would say abrogated. So what is abrogated? That the ayah is cancelled? No. Al-amal, doing and implementing that hukum would be basically by another later ayah that was revealed. So then we would consider applying that ayah in life is what has been abrogated, not the ayah. The ayah was not deleted. All right. Now, majority of the scholars did not consider that this ayah is abrogated. Let me first explain literally what the ayah is saying. When those that are basically making the distribution from ulul qurba, from their relatives and on the yatama and al-masakin, then give them from this distribution or from al-qisma, from the shares, and give them kind words. What is this actually talking about? The majority of the scholars considered that this was an ayah forgotten in terms of practice. So what does it mean? That this was a common practice when somebody by the text is not included within the distribution. In other words, they don't actually inherit. There is no share for them, but these people are relatives or orphans or needy. In other words, yes, they don't technically inherit, but they're actually relatives that are needy or orphans. And in that situation, even though they don't have an assigned portion or an assigned share within the inheritance, that we should give them something similar to a donation / wasiyya or a will. In other words, to just be like a kind gesture sort of thing, to include them, even though they don't actually buy the fractions of inheritance, they're not actually included. So it could be, for example, could be that this is a grandson, or this is a great grandson, or this is probably a niece. Does she actually inherit? Well, she's a niece and recently got divorced and now she's misplaced and all of these different things. That situation, we can say, well, although by the assignment of the Quran, she doesn't actually inherit, but because she's probably an orphan or because of the situation that she's in, we'll just include it as a donation that we would, as a a group of inheritors that we would just free will and our own willing, by our own will and willingly give her a share just to give that support. Now, so that's why the other scholars that said that, no, it's just forgotten in terms of practice, but that is basically the practice that before they would use to consider, which is not because they don't inherit, not because they're not included. It doesn't mean that they become forgotten, but there should be a donation that we should consider. This is, wallahu a'lam, the preponderant part about this ayah, and that it is not mansukha. It is not mansukha. فَارْزُقُوهُمْ minhu. Minhu means what? Minhu means from the inheritance. فَارْزُقُوهُمْ means give them part of that. Include them in that inheritance, even though they're not having they don't have an assigned portion, but give them part of it. وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. What does قُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا remind us of? The ayah right there, in where the ayah basically وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Remember, وَارْزُقُوهُمْ وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. And same thing here, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, فَارْزُقُوهُمْ مِنْهُ وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Why? Pretty much the same words, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding us that when you would give any type of a nice gesture, whether it was for a relative and not necessarily an assigned relative for the inheritance, or whether that was an orphan, or whether that was a needy person, don't brag about it that, hey, we're giving you this, but you recognize that you weren't supposed to be inheriting. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. You want to make a nice gesture, then don't brag about it. Why? Because by bragging about it, you had just canceled the good, kind act that you had just put in. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تُبْطِلُوا صَدَقَاتِكُمْ بِالْمَنِّ وَالْأَذَى. Don't cancel out the good deed بالمن, in any type of bragging about it, or al-adha. What is al-adha? Al-adha is basically somehow thinking that, well, I gave you this, now I have an upper hand over you. Or now I have given you something before, so I get to somehow abuse you and tell you that I've given you something, therefore I get to somehow control something over you. وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is emphasizing that even when you give somebody any contribution, whether that was any monetary contribution, or whether that was an effort or time, you did it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't keep on bringing it up because you contributed it for yourself, for your akhirah. Don't let the person feel or brag about it to somehow let that person be feeling that you are the one that somehow has the upper hand because they had somehow invested in you. If that is the case, then you didn't do it for the sake of Allah. You did it for the sake of the person. You did it for the sake of yourself. You did it in order to control others. You did it as a type of a narcissist behavior to somehow put in a way of control. It's a narcissist thing. Many narcissists would do that. They would somehow give you money, somehow give you privileges so you can depend on them, and then feel you can't get out. Because they invested not in you, but they invested to get a hold of you. That's why Islam forbid interest, because Islam wants you to be free. Islam wants nobody to control you. وَإِذَا حَضَرَ الْقِسْمَةَ. Oh, we skipped an A, didn't we? No. All right. وَلْيَخْشَ الَّذِينَ لَوْ تَرَكُوا مِنْ خَلْفِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّةً ضِعَافًا خَافُوا عَلَيْهِمْ فَلْيَتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَلْيَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا. What is the connection with this one? Well, it's coming after وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there, many times people might abuse al-yatama or the needy ones and etc. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling you, well, let those that have the upper hand, basically, let them. So this is definitely not mentioned in here, but this is putting in another prelude. So yeah, you might have the upper hand in terms of wealth, and you might have actually given that contribution to somebody that is a relative or an orphan or probably a needy, but we told you we told you to say good, kind words. And I want you to even go farther. وَلْيَخْشَ الَّذِينَ لَوْ تَرَكُوا مِنْ خَلْفِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّةً ضِعَافًا. Those you should fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is, وَلْيَخْشَ means have khashya, have fear that if you were to leave behind basically sons and daughters and ذُرِّيَّةً ضِعَافًا, a dhurriya, children that might be vulnerable, and you would fear over them. Well, if you're afraid for them, then in that situation, put yourself in the shoe of the deceased person and treat their sons the way you want your children to be treated. Huh? Fair? One day, you could actually end up with your children being vulnerable the same exact way that this orphan is vulnerable under your care. The golden rule. The golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, you yourself, you could die and you could leave behind vulnerable children, and I want you to treat the other person's vulnerable children the way you want your children to be treated. So fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that it will not come back to you or to your children. فَلْيَتَّقُوا اللَّهَ. Let them have taqwa. وَلْيَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا. And say, what is القول السديد? القول السديد. Yes, when you say sadid, basically means to hit the target. But how can words be sadid? When you say is sadid, is to put, when you put a line on something. But qawlan sadida, in where you're putting it in place. You're putting your words in place. And that's the best wisdom. The best wisdom is to know what to say and when to say it and how to say it and who to say it to. That's al-qawl al-sadid. The best qawl sadid is are the words that are basically coming by, just like Ibn al-Arabi, when he said about Abu Hanifa, as for Abu Hanifa, جعل القرآن مرآته فأبصر الحق. Abu Hanifa, he let the Quran be the lens that he sees through, and he was capable of seeing truth. Therefore, القول السديد involves الvision السديد. If you don't see things in the right perspective, there's no way that you could say the right explanation and the right interpretation. Where does it start? It starts with seeing things through the Quran and Sunnah. That's number one. Number two is basically learning how to say things at the right time, and within the right place, and that would make al-qawl al-sadid. Choosing the right time, the right place, and certainly the right people. That's al-qawl al-sadid. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, when we were talking about al-qawl al-sadid, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna min al-bayani la sihra." Even though the word "inna min al-bayani la sihra" from al-bayan, what is al-bayan? Al-bayan is eloquence. Some eloquence can carry within it magic. Although it's a metaphor, but this is in order to explain to us that, yes, it's a metaphor. It can be used in a good way, and it can be used in the wrong way. Some eloquence could actually carry within it a way of manipulation. Some eloquence can carry within it a way of manipulation, just like the narratives that are right now used today. They're putting out these narratives and they're very outspoken and etc., in where you would see the young generation being manipulated. It sounds so magical. It sounds like it makes sense. It plays on the emotions, and it basically goes in playing a type of magic / manipulation. In some min al-bayani la sihra, in where some eloquence could also have sihr to mean a positive force in bringing in a change in the person. So it depends on how you use it. So for those that had been given the eloquence, or let me say, the power of speech, it can be used in a good way and it can be used in a wrong way. But if you use it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you and will be testing you in that regards. Some of the most important Sahaba that were known for their eloquence, yes, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Suhail ibn Amr, Hassan ibn Thabit. Those were some of the Sahaba that were known for their eloquence. They knew how to talk. They knew how to let the person in front of them literally submit to their eloquence and to the way that they brought a good explanation. But remember, there's no way that you can do al-qawl al-sadid unless you have al-vision al-sadid, unless you have your vision in place. Because if your vision is blurry, then your words are basically saying not qawl sadid, but nothing but a dalal mubin. The opposite of al-qawl al-sadid is a dalal al-mubin. It's a dalal. Because al-qawl al-sadid, the words that are basically describing the realities, are basically the opposite of when a person has things murky, blurry, and then they're interpreting that. They think they're saying the right thing, but then they're confused about it because the vision is confused. The vision is confused, and they're going to come up with an outcome where they may be capable of saying things, but they're manipulated in their vision. They're manipulating others. And especially during our times where you've got social media, even though we should think that during our times, with the information being available and we could easily have access to it, we should think, and it would make common sense that, hey, we're able to get it, but it became harder. It became harder to get access to the right information because of the massive misinformation that is there. The massive information. It's so funny. Well, you know, when you're talking about Adrai, who's basically the spokesperson for the Israeli occupation force. He put out on his social media, Twitter or X right now, he put on it what? He actually put a picture on his social media saying that that basically is Gaza being targeted by the Israeli forces. Didn't even recognize that that was actually a picture of Idlib in Syria. He himself got confused. He's supposed to be the spokesperson for the Israeli forces. You know, it's like, oh, look at this person. Now he's confused on where to get his information from himself. We was being interviewed by Al Jazeera, and he was asking, well, what is happening? He was like, didn't you see the videos on TikTok? And then the correspondent in Al Jazeera, he was like, you actually get your information from TikTok? You could say it's just, we're in an area where it's information, where it's all confusing information. إن الذين يأكلون أموال اليتامى ظلما إنما يأكلون في بطونهم نارا وسيصلون سعيرا. Those that would, now here يأكلون, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's exclusive only to eating the orphan's wealth. So this is يأكلون, it's a metaphor to mean anybody that is taking up or gulping in or abusing the orphan's wealth in, of course, an oppressive manner, because they can deduct from that wealth for the sake of that orphan. So that's a different story. But this is a person that's taking what doesn't belong to them. إنما يأكلون في بطونهم نارا. As a matter of fact, they would be eating, in other words, gulping up, and in their stomachs, it's basically, the reality is they're eating fire. Well, it's not that if we were to do some kind of a GI surgery, that they're going to be finding fire in there. This is a metaphor. On Judgment Day, it will actually turn into fire in their stomachs. وَسَيَصْلَوْنَ سَعِيرًا. سَيَصْلَوْنَ. يَصْلَوْنَ actually means to be exposed on fire directly. On fire. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. سعيرا, it's basically the blaze of fire. I forgot to mention one thing, which is right there. If we are to basically حضر القسمة, so basically those that are in responsibility to distribute the wealth, and we had the relatives and etc., and they came over and they said, hey, can we get a portion? Our situation, etc., and we wanted to donate to them. What if the person that we're distributing their wealth was an orphan? So this is a minor, and their father left behind, let's say, millions, okay? And then they had a relative who was not an inheritor, or an orphan, another orphan, or another needy. Should we give them part of the orphan's share, basically, and say, well, we're going to apply this ayah, or should we wait until they grow older to make the decision? Differences of opinions between scholars. The first group of scholars, they said no, because this is a donation, we don't have the right to deduct as a donation from the orphan's wealth, or at least from this minor's wealth, and give it not as a donation, not to a yatim, and not to an orphan, not to a needy person, and certainly not to a relative. That was the first opinion. We don't deduct it from an orphan. The second opinion, well, no, if we are the ones responsible and the guardians over the orphan's wealth, as long as we're giving a portion that's not harming this minor person, we're not harming them by deducting a donation to somebody of these three categories, then the person in charge, that is the guardian in that situation, can make the decision on behalf of the minor. So the first opinion said, no, we can't have anybody make the decision on behalf of a minor when it regards to donations. When it regards to donations. In other words, the guardian is supposed to be working on what is supposed to be working on what they have the right to basically solve and resolve the matters that relate to the yatim, but not give a type of donation. That's a different story. Zakah is different. We do deduct zakah from a yatim's money. Got it? Because the zakah is on the money and not the person. Okay, we would deduct zakah from the minor and the orphan's money, but then they had differences of opinions if we're talking about situation where we wanted to give a donation on their behalf. So now those are two opinions. Go ahead, my dear.
Okay, let's say someone has adult children, right?
Adult, say it again.
Adult kids, they're all grown up. I mean, and then they have their own lives and they run off and everything is good. And they think, oh yeah, they're all good. So what about I put the money that I work on, towards Sadaqah Jariyah. Let's say I build a masjid and I have the government or someplace, someone kind of taking care of that to be a Sadaqah Jariyah on my behalf instead of giving it to my kids. Is that okay?
Fair enough. So the question is, if a person decided to put all their wealth in charity, okay, and not necessarily leave it behind for inheritors, because you would know that the inheritors, anyways, they're all well off, so why give it to them? Now, if you're doing something during your life and you decided to put all your money in charity, that's basically left to you. Even if you put all your money, 100% in charity, no one can object to it. If it's your money, you can put it in charity. But if you decide that this money that you put in charity would not be put in charity until you die, then in that situation, we say, wait a minute, this is a wasiyah. Only 1/3 of it. Got it? Only 1/3 of it. So in that situation, if you're basically saying, well, don't implement it until I die, we would say, what? Only 1/3 of it we put in charity, because you basically made this a wasiyah after you die. We treat it as a wasiyah after your death and not during your life. Got it? Now, the other thing is that the Prophet ﷺ, for those that would have the intention to put all their wealth in charity so that they don't want to give their children, the Prophet ﷺ actually said, لأن تذر ورثتك أغنياء, to leave your inheritors as rich is better than leaving them poor and needing others to support them. This is important to keep in mind. So it depends on the situation. It depends on the situation. In Palestine, there is Hajj Musa al-Khalis. He used to live really close to us. An older man, very old, blonde, older man. He had 4 boys. And he owned a lot of property in Al-Quds area. He had 2 sons that were, let's just call them those that were part of the resistance, okay? But they were imprisoned for life. 2 sons. 2 other sons, nothing but alcoholics. The 2 sons are imprisoned for life, and 2 other sons, nothing but alcoholics. So what this man did is make a will and give all his wealth for al-awqaf. All his wealth, all the property, while he was alive, he actually gave it for al-awqaf because he knew that the other two sons were never going to come out. And the other two sons are just alcoholics, that they will end up selling all the property to the Jews and the Israelis. So he basically gave all his property, and it's a lot of property worth millions. He gave it to al-awqaf, which basically is under the awqaf control, which is an Islamic ministry. All of his wealth. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he died. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, give him a khair al-jaza for doing this. And, part of the wealth is basically in Bab al-Qattanin, which is which is actually at the door of one of the Masjid al-Aqsa. And that is right now part of Jami'at al-Quds. So if you guys ever go there, inshallah, maybe we'll show you around some of it, inshallah. All right, any other questions before? And I'm going to even give the chance for those that are online to also ask questions if there are any, inshallah. I know there's so much to say. Sorry, ladies, I kind of got carried away with Palestine. I haven't been sleeping right, you guys. I was even dreaming that I was in Gaza and they were going to bomb the house over my head and all of that. That's how much I'm living in Palestine right now. I just cannot separate myself away from Palestine whatsoever. It's just right there. I'm imagining everything and I'm hearing it and living it in each and every single moment in my day. All right, any other questions that anybody would like to ask? And if you would like to unmute yourselves, that's also okay. And Rabbi yahfadhku. Yes, Palestine is Aqidah, exactly. Is Somalia Aqidah? If Somalis are going to get angry, Is it Aqidah? Why not? Not as much as Palestine, but
I don't know the story. I don't know.
You don't know the story?
No.
Well, I mean, for Somalia?
Yeah.
For Somalia? I mean, Somalia was actually as part of the Muslim land. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like any other Muslim land.
Yeah.
Somalia was part of the general Habasha at one point, and also was part where they were connected with Yemen, right? They had a lot of Sahaba were affiliated with Yemen, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, all the Sahaba, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari and all the Ash'ari were actually from Yemen. So you're talking about Yemen, you're talking about Somalis. You can combine them in. Right now, of course, speaking about Somalia, there were actually a number of Hanafi scholars, in Zayla, a number of great Hanafi scholars from the area of Zayla. If you were to go to the book, it's called Mu'jam A'lam al-Mu'allifin for Umar Rida Kahala. The book is in 15, 16 volumes. In the way that it's divided is that it would basically be under the names of those scholars, under the last names at least, or the names that they are famous for. So you will see a lot of the scholars from Zayla, and a lot of Somali scholars you could easily go to, especially the Hanafi madhab and the Shafi'i madhab. There were a lot of Somali scholars that I think it would be important to revive those names, and let the Somalis recognize their heritage of those great scholars. In fact, you had some scholars that even taught some of the most important scholars, like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and even al-Hafiz al-Iraqi and all of those. They actually learned from a lot of the scholars from Zayla. And especially Zayla in Somalia was, I was looking through a lot of the different names, but Zayla stands out. Zayla stands out to be one of the most important cities that had important Hanafi scholars that were very important Hanafi scholars for the Hanafi madhab. So important to look into that. And when you even just look, if you go back to Umar Rida Kahala's book, Mu'jam Mu'allifin, just go to Zayla. Just go to Zayla and you will see, just from Zayla alone, you will see over 100 names, of important muhaddithin and fuqaha and mufassirin and nahawiyin, even scholars even in Lugha Arabiya. So it would be really interesting. Just Zayla, I didn't even talk about the other cities. I didn't even talk about Mogadishu, and I didn't talk about the other cities. Just talking about Zayla. And really important to actually, it's really easy to get to, by the way. I'm not talking about Zayla, but I'm actually talking about the resources to get to these scholars. Really easy to get to them. I'd be happy to assist anybody that wants to, do like a study on a lot of these scholars in order to revive their history within our ummah. And this is important because there's no way that you can revive a person's identity unless you make them aware of their own history. Who are you? What are you? What did your ancestors go through to make you who you are today? Because if you don't recognize the efforts and the contributions that had been put in to make you Muslim, then you're not appreciating the efforts that made you who you are. And this is something that really scares me, especially in the generation that came to America, that they don't really know all the efforts that made them Muslim, whether it's me as a Palestinian or as a Mali or a person from Tunisia or a person from Somalia. If you don't know all the great ulama, all the great mujahideen, all the great muhaddithin, all the great salihin that had preceded you in order to make you who you are, then are you really recognizing what you are? Are you really recognizing what you are? Are you really recognize your identity? Are you recognizing the most important thing about who you are, the value that you carry, the principle that you carry? Are you recognizing it? If you're not recognizing it, then you're not recognizing those that had made you who you are.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
He does that then right on.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
The resource that I would recommend in learning Islamic history, Raghib al-Sirjani has a website, it's called Islamic History. And he has actually done a lot of work, and please donate to their website. He has done a lot of great work in teaching about Islamic history. And in his website, there are a lot of resources that teach about Islamic history. And definitely donate to their website in order to make it possible to translate those resources, because Islamic history and learning that piece of history is actually part of Aqidah. It's part of Aqidah. We start out talking about Palestine. You can't learn, You can't learn about Palestine if you don't know Aqidah.
I know that today.
Yeah,
I used to
you
be
can.
about like social justice as well. It's
No,
all about
it's-
ignorance. You don't know.
No, it's
What was that
Aqidah.
website?
Islamic history. It's called Islam Story. Islam Story. I think it's Islam Story or something like that. So check it out. Definitely donate to that cause. And if somebody wants to unmute themselves, I'd be happy to listen. You got something to say? No? Okay. So this is it, inshallah. And if somebody wants to unmute themselves, I'd be happy to listen to it as well. IslamicHistory.org. Is it Islamic history or Islam Story? No, it's, you know what? Let me look it up right now. Can't remember if it's Islam Story or Islamic history. Maybe I'll just look it up right now. Raghib al-Sirjani is basically, you know, his website, and he has done an outstanding job. Raghib al-Sirjani is a urologist, an Egyptian urologist. I know it's really strange. He's a urologist, but he had done an outstanding job in making Islamic history something. This is the guy making it. Oh, here we go. It's called Islam Story. That's the guy that he's Egyptian, and he basically did an outstanding job in making Islamic history something that is understood, something that people will connect to. And you could see, oh, there we go, look at that. So he basically put you the English part of it. What is that? French, Spanish. I wonder what that language is. Portuguese. Oh, okay. I didn't even know, to be honest. Let's see the English sort of it. He's really smart, to be honest. He's very smart. So here we go. Here's the library, and he put you a number of different things. Okay, this is supposed to be English, but then it's Arabic. Hold on, let me see if we put on them. Okay, so here we go. Photo gallery. The Prophet. Okay. It's taking some time to upload, I'm assuming. Yeah, it's taking some time to upload, but look into this website, and he does actually have, so here we go for library. He does actually have a good resource. So here we go. So here's Ayn Jalut, and it's basically, yeah, you're going to have a lot of people call him, you know, Sultan and all of that stuff, but take the good from the good. And if somebody goes wrong, you disagree with them, doesn't mean you cancel out all the good things that they had contributed. You're going to have a lot of people say, well, he supported Sisi and all of that stuff, which is true. But at the end of the day is that if they have a good contribution, take the good. It's that simple. So support what is good, and yes, make people's awareness of history. And I know that there is a place to donate. So definitely donate for their cause. I don't know where, but definitely do it. How do we get to that? Okay, well, you'll search for it. Well, they're hiring too. See, got it. Got hiring too. Okay, and any questions? May Allah, Ameen Ya Rabbi. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect them, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, Allahumma ansur Islam wal Muslimin. Fi kulli makan. I like that one. Fi kulli makan. Yes, whether we're talking about Somalia, where are you from? You're Somali too?
Me? No, I'm not Somali. My dad's African American convert, and my mom's from Bangladesh.
Bangladesh. Really? Oh Allah, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give Bangladesh also victory. They're going through a lot. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They're, you know, their resources are abused. They're really using Bangladesh as a dumping place, really, as a dumping place. It's really sad. All the diseases and all, you know, just look at Dhaka itself, and just the place you're talking about, almost 159 million in a place that is so small. But then, hey, you know, it's really sad. And of course, Islam is targeted there by their Hasina, so that's a different story. But yeah, learn more about it, inshallah. Yeah, some scholar, was it almost 6 years ago? An important scholar was actually killed, assassinated, executed actually by Hasina herself. And yeah, so look into it, inshallah. So, all right. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give victory to the Muslims. all around. Bangladesh, Mali,
Yeah.
Somalia, Tunisia, Palestine. Oh man, that makes it all over the world.
Yeah.
Where's your husband from?
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, the Oromos.
Yeah.
Allah al-Musta'an, Allah al-Musta'an. Muslims are targeted everywhere. Afghanistan, Oromo, there
Yeah,
you go.
Afghanistan, yeah.
Iraq, Syria, Egypt,
Morocco.
Morocco. So, oh,
Libya.
Ya Allah. Libya, Ya Haram, Libya, and the story that happened there. A whole city wiped out like it was never there. So this is it, inshallah. We'll see you all next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa
Friday or
rahmatullah.
next week?
What was that?
Friday or next week?
What was that?
On Friday or next week?
Yeah, Friday.
Inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah. This
Inshallah,
ayah,
Jazakallah khair.
wa iyyakum, inshallah, we will continue. It's gonna be easy. Inshallah. All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.